So, the church I pastor at, we like to have a bit of back and forth between the audience. I don't know whether that's something you're comfortable with or not, but we're going to try something here. Just a simple question. Are you folks familiar with the concept of social location or social context? Is anyone familiar with that phrase? You don't have to be. Okay, that's great. Then I won't be telling you something you don't already know. It's the idea that where we live, the things we do, the places we go, the experiences we have in our bodies of being rich or poor, disabled or able-bodied, gay or straight, cis or trans, citizen, immigrant, refugees, illiterate or highly educated, that all of these realities contribute to how we see the world, to what we notice about what's going on around us, and to how we understand the stories we read and the ideas we come across. And our social locations, what we have experienced and also what we have not experienced, they flow in and through everything we do. And this is great when we have a broad range of people and their experiences to draw on, right? But what I've noticed is that so often the texts that we read about disability and the church, the way we study theology, the way we think about God is misshapen by the absence of certain voices, by the absence often of the most marginalized voices on that social context wheel. And especially by the experiences of not only disability, but disability that is intersected with poverty and other marginalizations that lead to people's stigmatization and their invisibility. So, in some spaces, there's a move to talk about disability and the church by talking about whether or not people with disabilities should be able to come to church or not, right? If you can put up this slide, perhaps you can see from this picture, the next one along. It's okay, we can wait for it. This is worth seeing. This is a church around the corner from my house. And you can see from this picture why this conversation of whether people with disabilities should be included in the church is necessary. Because although they have a sign that says all are welcome, for some reason the all is in quotes. I have not figured out why. It's at the top of a flight of stairs. And so I'm not quite sure how they're going to welcome me into their building since there are stairs between me and the front door. And obviously, it's clear to me this morning that Lawrence Park Community Church has done the thinking at this level. You've done a great job. I could park in a fully accessible parking spot. I could wheel straight through the doors. I think there were buttons. There was even a ramp up to the stage. This is not always the case, let me tell you. So it was lovely. It was wonderful. I feel warmly welcomed. But what can be harder, I think, is learning how to move beyond simply welcoming to belonging. And especially moving to belonging on the very outside edges of the margins, right? Just like the work we're collectively involved in with responding well to the 94 recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just like the work that's involved in becoming certified as an Affirm United congregation, there's work to be done to start to think beyond simply letting people who are diverse into our buildings and moving to honoring and valuing their deeply needed contribution to our local expressions of the body of Christ. And I think what's really important here is it's so easy to miss out on what our social location has no experience of, right? We notice the things that we have experience of, and we notice the things those around us have experience of, but what about the people we haven't spent time with? What about the people we're not noticing? What do we lose when we don't hear from them? Now, this invisibilization that happens to people that we have excluded on the edges of the margins is not a new problem. It is actually just a very human problem. And that means it's not surprising that we see it show up in the Gospels or that we see it showing up when we read the Gospels, right? So today I want to take some time with both of these problems by looking at a story where that happens in the Gospel of Mark. It's traditionally called the healing of blind Bartimaeus, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable with giving so much expectation about how we're going to understand this passage with that phrase. So I'm just going to call it Jesus and Bartimaeus. Does that work for us? So if you pick up a commentary on this passage, almost any commentary, in fact, the story of healing would be described as a bookend of sections in Mark. There's a healing of a blind man in Bethsaida in Mark 8, and then there's a bunch of passages that are seen as examples that the disciples are not really getting it when it comes to who Jesus is and what he's there to do. And then there's this passage of the healing of Bartimaeus. And so these two physically blind men have been set up as bookends for what is called, I think problematically, spiritual blindness in between these two passages. So the problem is that people who have been reading and commentating and discussing these passages over the centuries seem to have little social context of disabled friends and writings. And so I think that their social location has made it far too easy for them to miss what's going on in this story, ironically. They coast by it and they dismiss many things in this story as unimportant. And I want to draw us back from that a little bit this morning. I want to see if we can open the story up a little bit more beyond just as a transition moment in the narrative. I want us to pay attention to the blindness here, but I don't think it's going to be enough for us to just pay attention to the blindness. Even those who have a disability focus and understanding, those who can point out details about what it's like to be blind, to move unaided through the world without the sense of sight, largely fail to pick up on the social and economic poverty that Bartimaeus also lives with, or the stigma, the relative powerlessness that comes with that. To capture those issues, we need the help of scholars who have researched the experience of blindness in Greco-Roman and Jewish writings before, during, and after the period. And we also need the work of scholars who have looked at the economic realities of poverty as well. And one such individual, and there aren't a lot of them, I admit, who did this was a man named Felix Just. And in his 1997 Yale Divinity dissertation, he carefully and painstakingly helped to create an understanding of the social location and context that Bartimaeus found himself in. And his research helps us understand a few things that are going on and that are going to be important to how we read this story. He explains that sight and vision were seen by Greeks, Romans, and Jews in a hierarchy. All of the senses were in a hierarchy. And sight and vision, that was at the top of the hierarchy. That was the most important. Your sense of touch, that didn't matter so much. Your sense of smell, whatever. But sight, that was what mattered. And because of that, there were actually some limits socially in terms of what you could and could not do if you were blind. You couldn't go into the temple. You couldn't necessarily participate in the legal system. There were rules. But blindness didn't automatically disregard you or make you disrespected. And there weren't as many limits as you might have thought. We look at the stories of Isaac and Jacob from the book of Genesis, and they make it clear that social respect within Jewish culture could continue easily when someone was blind. Other Jewish writings from the book of Tobit, from the Mishnah, they make it clear that those who were blind typically continued to have a place in their families and in the religious communities. Why does this matter? This matters because when the story opens, we find Bartimaeus sitting on the side of the road begging alone. So we have to start to ask some questions. He's not like the blind beggar who is healed at Bethsaida. He doesn't come with family. There's no one who brings him to Jesus. He is sitting there on his own. And not only that, but the people actively work to hush him, to disrespect him, to dismiss him. So we have to ask the question, if this isn't the cultural norm, why is it happening in this story at this time? What is it about Bartimaeus' social location that's unique? Why has he lost social respect and support? So to understand all of that, we need to think not just about blindness, but about poverty. Or in this case, extreme poverty. Poverty to the point of destitution. Because it turns out that not every person who was blind in first century Palestine was a beggar. Some of them worked. They worked as farmers. They might have worked grazing animals. Some of them even worked butchering meat. We have evidence of this. Isn't that wild? Fully blind, can't see a thing, butchering meat. I'm very impressed. And then others had the support of family and friends. They had extensive networks of support that went beyond just their immediate family. There were gleaning laws. There were tithes for the poor that were available to help people when they got into trouble. And there was even a special early insurance policy that was set up at the temple. You could pay into it when life was going well, and then you could draw from it if life didn't go so well for you for a little bit. Isn't that wild? I did not know that went back so far. And that's all well and good for some people, right? Just like today, our employment insurance can get you through if you've paid into it and you lose your job for a couple of months, especially if you've got a little bit of savings tucked aside. Or maybe, you're not doing quite so well, but you could pay your bills as long as you visit the food bank a couple times over the winter when the heating bills get too big, right? But these are sort of the top levels of poverty and disability in early first century Palestine. The problem is there's one more level underneath of it. And the problem is there's one more level underneath of those for us as well. It's the level of destitution. In first century Palestine, destitution meant that when you woke up that morning, you did not have the means to feed yourself for the day. You were a beggar. We might, though, expand our thinking about destitution beyond just homelessness and begging to those who are on social assistance, those who are on Ontario Works and those on Ontario Disability Support Program. Because the stigma that goes along with those spaces is similar, is very, very similar to what is experienced in this first century Palestinian world. Right? So there are those who are poor, and they still remain part of society. They still get to be part of, family gatherings and community gatherings. They have a social capital of network. They have friends and extended family. And then there are the destitute, and they are simply excluded. If you became blind and you didn't have family to depend on, if you didn't have work you could do, if the loan sharks took your farm or they took your tools and you could no longer do your job, if malnutrition and all of the things that come along with poverty brought you down further and further and further, eventually you would become destitute. And just like today, when you were destitute, you were also stigmatized. Your position in the community threatened the whole community. So broadly speaking, stigma is how we think about and how we respond to those we deem to be undesirably or unacceptably different from ourselves. The more undesirable or unacceptable their bodies and economic positions are, the more socially undesirable or unacceptable people become. So what this means is that it's very easy for those of us who have social power and privilege, economic, education, relationships, able-bodiedness, able-mindedness, power and privilege, to become the ones who decide, however subconsciously, who has value and who is therefore able to participate in the rhythms of social life. Not only that, but the process of stigma allows us to erect walls between us and whoever we have stigmatized, removing or limiting both our sense of responsibility toward those we have stigmatized and reducing our fears that we will be afflicted in similar ways. Stereotypes, especially religiously developed stereotypes that might assume that blindness or destitution or some other stigmatizing position are caused by divine punishment, they allow the maintenance and the strengthening of these barriers between us. It's a real problem. And another problem is that they are socially contagious. Even when we consciously decide that this is incorrect, that this is problematic, it's difficult to even recognize when we have again caught this idea and that we are yet again operating off of it in our interactions with those who are different from us. Where stigma is the strongest, a sense of being cloaked in invisibility becomes both pervasive and dangerous to the person's well-being. For the person experiencing stigma, the most common response is acquiescence. The expected response is acquiescence. Just accept the little you're being given and thank us for it. Don't push too hard. Don't rock the boat. Don't meddle. All of this is going on behind the scenes in this story. In this passage, Jesus is coming out of the bustling metropolis of Jericho. He's on the way to Jerusalem. It's 15 miles away. And so the crowds that are gathering towards Passover are filling out. More and more people are joining the throng. This is the large crowd that Jesus is part of as he leaves Jericho. And across the noise of this buoyant and eager crowd on the way to celebrate their salvation from Egypt and God's deliverance from the destitution of slavery, the voice of a blind and destitute, stigmatized man cries out over the crowd, "Jesus, Son of David, have pity on me." I'm pretty sure if it had been anyone else in the crowd that day, the response would have been different. A farmer bringing his blind child, a woman from Jericho bringing her blind mother, a fellow blind traveler on the road. It's not the time or the place that results in the crowd scolding of him. It's not his disability or his poverty. It's his refusal to play by the social rules that said that since he was destitute, he should acquiesce. That's what gets him in trouble. This is the unspoken agreement. If he sits there silently, he'll get handouts silently, and nobody needs to feel too bad about any of it, right? No one will challenge anything too much, and then he'll be kept alive, and everybody they'll be good. But when we understand that, it changes what Bartimaeus does in this story, doesn't it? All of a sudden, we realize that by crying out to Jesus, Bartimaeus is breaking the rules. Bartimaeus says, "I'm not interested in playing this game. Jesus is too important to play this game with." He takes the risk. And I wonder how the crowd felt when Jesus told them to bring Bartimaeus to him after all that. I wonder what happened to their internal safety net, their feeling of protection against the stigma of Bartimaeus' life that happened when Jesus stopped them in their tracks. Now, I know that this story is a little unclear. It seems like the crowd says one thing, and then Jesus speaks, and then the crowd says something completely different. But I think that is too flat a reading of the text. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and so there's people who have been following along with him and have heard all the stories and seen the miracles on the way. And I think that they might be that second group of the crowd that gathers him up and pulls him in. But I think that maybe the people who have just joined that morning, right? The people who have just come out of their homes in Jericho, maybe they're the ones who feel more threatened by Bartimaeus in the first place. Maybe they're the ones who end up saying, "Be quiet, sit down, shut up. He's important. Don't you know your place?" Either way, there are complex dynamics and different forces at work in the crowd that day. But when Jesus speaks, Bartimaeus is given space and he comes forward. And when he comes forward, Jesus does something really important before he heals him. He puts this stigma-bearing rebel centered right in front of him in the middle of the crowd. He takes him from the margins and he puts him in the middle and he says, "You are important." And then he gives the voiceless Bartimaeus back his voice. Bartimaeus hadn't lost his voice physically, but he had lost his voice socially. And Jesus gives him back a voice. He doesn't presume what Bartimaeus wants. He doesn't presume what Bartimaeus needs. He asks Bartimaeus, "What do you want me to do for you?" Bartimaeus replies, "Teacher, I want to see." And then in the only healing story like it, throughout the Gospels or any other ancient text, Bartimaeus is simply declared healed. Healing takes place not by Jesus placing his hands on Bartimaeus' face or using spit or mud or water or sending him to bathe in a nearby river. He doesn't do any of those things. It takes place in the relational space in between Jesus and Bartimaeus. Buber talks about this as the I-thou. It's this amazing space where we become human to and with each other. Disabled theologian Sharon Betcher argues that the purposes for miracles in the Gospels, even the rumor of such miracles, is interruption and resistance, destabilization of our expectations at every level, destabilizing of the dominant ways of defining and valuing life. As with many of the other stories of healing in the Gospels, however, it's not simply that Jesus was involved in this work of reordering the social world he finds himself in. It's not just Jesus who is involved in this miracle. There is a dance between Jesus and Bartimaeus, a dance that first halts the crowd in their tracks and then leaves them witnesses to an experience they cannot forget. They're forced to consider how they will now live in response. Bartimaeus the invisible has been made visible in collaboration with Jesus. And he follows Jesus with a newfound eagerness to value life by a new set of rules, fully aware of the harm that is caused when people are written off and stigmatized as undesirable and unacceptable. What is less clear to me is what happens to the rest of the crowd. Do they get it? The same could be asked for us as readers down through the ages. Do we catch the stigma-destroying, social rule-upending power of this moment? The invitation not just to Bartimaeus to come to Jesus, but to the crowd to see him and hear him and value him. What will happen to those of us who continue to bear witness to this moment of healing? Let's pray. Creator of all, Would you allow us to be challenged by those we have deemed unworthy of our thought, time, or attention? Would you cause us to see the humanity in those we have distanced ourselves from, that we may be more equipped to follow you and love our neighbors as ourselves? Amen.